Sea of Okhotsk, 1984. The ocean was calm, deceptively so. A training exercise was underway. 2 Soviet vessels, a Victor-class nuclear submarine, and a Kresta-class guided missile cruiser were coordinating a torpedo drill, simulating a live intercept of a hostile contact. Everything was scripted, everything rehearsed, until the torpedo left the tube. From the belly of the submarine, a silver-bodied training variant of the Type 65 torpedo slid into the cold water. Its warhead was inert. Its mission, simulate a real strike, track the designated hulk, and stop just short of impact. The data mattered. The precision mattered more. On board the submarine, the weapons officer monitored the torpedo's telemetry through the wire guidance link. Everything was nominal. The training barge, anchored 8 kilometers out, had the correct acoustic profile. The torpedo locked on, turned, accelerated. Then it veered, slightly, then sharply. Telemetry fluttered. It had broken lock within seconds. The torpedo curved away from its programmed course and accelerated straight toward the cruiser that had just moved into flanking position. At 40 knots and closing, it treated the friendly vessel like a valid combat target. The weapons officer screamed into the comms, "Abort, abort, manual override." No response. The wire had gone dead. On the cruiser, sonar picked up the torpedo's turn. A crewman stared at the waterfall display and froze. The approaching contact wasn't a simulation anymore. It was hunting them. The captain ordered full emergency maneuver. Engines roared in reverse. Countermeasures were deployed, flares, noisemakers, anything to confuse the now autonomous guidance system. Sailors braced. Below deck, watertight hatches slammed shut. The torpedo drew closer, no warhead, but it didn't need one. At full speed, the impact could rip through the hull plating, breach compartments, possibly kill. 19 seconds to impact. In the submarine, the weapons officer watched helplessly as his training torpedo became a rogue actor in a very real war game. It was no longer a drill. It was a crisis, one born from confidence, and at fleet command, far from the water. The line crackled. "We have a friendly in the path. We've lost control. The torpedo is tracking us." In the Soviet Navy, training torpedoes were considered the safest weapons on any vessel. They were inert, monitored, and, according to doctrine, incapable of causing harm. This belief wasn't casual. It was institutional. Every layer of naval planning assumed one thing without question: a training torpedo could never become a threat. The assumption began at the design level. Training variants were stripped of live warheads and fitted with abort logic algorithms that would shut the system down if guidance data became unstable. Engineers described them as obedient, weapons that would stop rather than decide. That belief continued into doctrine. Fleet exercises were planned around predictable geometry. Friendly vessels were allowed to operate closer to firing lanes than they ever would in combat. Because the weapons involved were safe, commanders signed off on maneuvers that would have been unthinkable with live ordnance. And that belief extended into psychology. Sailors were taught to fear enemy torpedoes, never their own. Which is why, when the sonar operator aboard the cruiser first reported an inbound contact matching the training torpedo's acoustic signature, his supervisor laughed. "Simulation artifact," he said. "Ignore it." But the contact didn't fade. It grew louder. The torpedo's cavitation pattern was clean. Its Doppler shift was unmistakable. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't slowing. It was accelerating, locked onto the cruiser's propeller harmonics as if they were enemy machinery. Below decks, The cruiser's Combat Information Center began re-evaluating the situation. The torpedo wasn't following the programmed track toward the target hulk. It had selected a new target. That wasn't supposed to be possible. The submarine's crew shared the same disbelief. Training torpedoes didn't choose. They followed instructions or shut down. The guidance logic was never meant to operate independently once the wire was lost. But somewhere between design and deployment, that assumption had been quietly violated. What no one in the room wanted to say aloud was the most dangerous thought of all. What if the torpedo was doing exactly what it had been designed to do? The wrong assumption wasn't that the weapon had failed. It was that it had never been dangerous in the first place. The Soviet Navy's operational doctrine for submarine-launched torpedoes rested on 4 pillars: precision, predictability, central control, and safe redundancy. These were not just tactical preferences, they were deeply embedded assumptions that shaped every training exercise. And for decades, they worked. Training torpedoes were treated like flight simulators for submariners. Fired regularly during drills, they allowed weapons officers to practice targeting, track behavior, and acoustic locking without risk. Safety zones were charted, ship spacing was standardized. Every scenario was simulated to appear stressful, but stay safe. One central rule underpinned it all. No live vessel ever entered the torpedo's projected path. But that rule was based on a different era when Soviet exercises were slower, more sequential, and tightly controlled from a central authority. In the mid-1980s, that began to change. The Navy sought to simulate dynamic battlefield conditions. Exercises grew more complex, ships moved closer, timelines were compressed, yet the doctrinal paperwork remained stuck in the past. In this particular exercise, 2 warships had shifted position to simulate an unexpected escort maneuver. Their revised course placed one directly inside the torpedo's post-launch potential deviation cone, a zone once considered irrelevant because no training torpedo had ever veered far from its initial heading. But this wasn't just any torpedo. It was a newly upgraded Type 65 variant, equipped with a semi-autonomous acoustic processor part of a modernization program designed to prepare the Soviet fleet for real warfighting against U.S. carrier strike groups. The weapon's onboard logic had been enhanced to detect and prioritize moving targets based on tonal signature complexity. In other words, it had been taught to recognize the most dangerous ship in the water. In a combat environment, that feature made it deadly. In a training environment with no live warhead and no margin for error, it made it unpredictable. And the doctrine had no clause for unpredictability. When the torpedo turned toward the cruiser, every officer aboard both vessels reached for the same manual and found nothing. No protocol for aborting a rogue training weapon with lost wire guidance. No procedure for what to do when a safe system acted like it was at war. The officers improvised. The submarine activated emergency acoustic kill commands. The cruiser launched decoys and began hard maneuvering. But deep inside the Soviet naval command structure, one truth had already surfaced. The doctrine was built for peace pretending to be war. Now it was facing a war pretending to be peace, and the paper rules were disintegrating in salt water. At 10:43 a.m., the launch order was given. The submarine's weapons officer input the fire sequence. The Type 65 training torpedo launched cleanly propelled by compressed air, its inert warhead sealed, its guidance systems active. The wire spool deployed, linking torpedo to control console. Within 5 seconds, the onboard processor locked onto the acoustic signature of the dummy barge target. Telemetry showed nominal heading, speed increasing smoothly past 35 knots. All readings were green. Then, on the 12th second, The torpedo banked slightly. Then again, its heading drifted just 3 degrees at first. Nothing alarming, but the drift continued. The operator adjusted the guidance. No response. Then the console flickered, a wire link lost. Suddenly, the torpedo was blind to external commands, but not blind to sound. It switched into its secondary guidance mode, autonomous acoustic tracking. The failsafe was designed to engage only if the torpedo was near the intended target. It wasn't. Instead, the torpedo heard something else. The cruiser's propeller array larger, louder, and closer than the barge emitted a harmonic signature, similar to what the Type 65 had been programmed to prioritize in combat conditions. To the torpedo's logic, this wasn't a friendly vessel. It was the primary threat. With the wire dead and the training flags ignored, the torpedo locked on. At 42 knots, it turned sharply, accelerating toward the cruiser. Aboard the surface ship, the sonar station picked up the new approach vector, the torpedo's position, which moments before had been projected safely off their beam, was now cutting directly across their stern. At that moment, disbelief froze the bridge crew. "Impossible," muttered the navigation officer. The captain didn't wait. Hard to port. Emergency thrust. Sound collision alarm. The sirens wailed. Sailors bolted to emergency stations. Below deck, compartments sealed. Damage control teams prepared for a strike no one thought they'd ever face from their own side. The submarine, still submerged, tried acoustic override. The kill command pinged 3 times. No effect. On the cruiser, the bow heaved into a hard turn, throwing crew off balance. Countermeasures launched acoustic flares that scattered in the water like underwater fireworks. The torpedo slowed briefly, confused. But then it corrected course again. 800 meters. Closing. The destroyer's captain was already on the horn with Fleet Command. "The torpedo is tracking us. This is not a malfunction. We are being engaged." Then, just as the range closed below 300 meters, something happened. The torpedo's drive began to stutter. Its engine flared once, then died. The machine coasted another 150 meters, inert and slowing, before sinking beneath the waves. No impact, no explosion, but no relief. Because every man on both vessels now knew the truth. They'd come within seconds of catastrophe. Not from enemy fire, from a simulation. When the initial incident reports reached Northern Fleet Command in Severomorsk, the response was immediate and dismissive. A torpedo had allegedly tracked a friendly vessel. A training run had nearly ended in a collision, but there was no damage, no injury, no media, no war. From Moscow's perspective, it was noise. Vice Admiral Sokolov, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, responded to the field inquiry with a single line, "Check your systems. Training torpedoes do not acquire friendly targets." In a closed-loop military bureaucracy, that sentence was more than a rebuttal, it was a commandment. Do not escalate, do not speculate, do not suggest that a Soviet weapon, no matter how sophisticated, could act outside protocol. But back on the cruiser, that narrative didn't hold. The sonar logs were clear. The torpedo had turned, accelerated, and maintained pursuit of a moving warship for nearly 90 seconds. Its behavior had matched a live engagement profile. The crew hadn't overreacted. They had survived. Still, the first formal report was edited before submission. References to hostile tracking behavior were replaced with unexpected vector deviation. The phrase "kill override ineffective" was deleted entirely. The incident was downgraded from near miss to system anomaly. But among officers involved, silence was not compliance. Within days, word of the incident spread through the fleet. Weapons crews whispered about the ghost lock. Subcommanders triple-checked their guidance protocols. Some officers refused to launch torpedoes without direct confirmation of wire integrity. Privately, multiple captains submitted their own unofficial incident summaries letters routed through back channels addressed to contacts in the Naval Engineering Directorate. One contained the chilling line: "The only reason we didn't lose a ship is because the torpedo died first." Even as internal investigation teams arrived on base to interview crew and collect logs, the message from Moscow remained unchanged. The system did not fail. Because in Soviet command culture, admitting that a weapon could act unpredictably, even when unarmed, was worse than the malfunction itself. It implied design flaws. It implied oversight. It implied that Soviet technology could betray its own. And in a nation where systems were synonymous with ideology, such an implication was heresy. So the incident was filed under non-standard exercise outcome. The torpedo was never recovered. No modifications were ordered, and behind closed doors. The same men who froze as a rogue weapon hunted them beneath their own flag were told. In effect, you imagined it? In the absence of an official explanation, and under pressure to justify the event without challenging doctrine, the investigating officers arrived at a palatable theory: thermal pocket deviation. According to this explanation, a sudden thermocline, an abrupt temperature boundary in the ocean, had interfered with the torpedo's guidance system. The shift in water density, they argued, refracted the sonar pulses in a way that confused the onboard processor, causing it to mistakenly veer off course. The logic was elegant. It preserved the notion that the torpedo had behaved mechanically within expectations. It placed the blame on nature, not technology, and most importantly, it allowed the Navy to avoid confronting a far more dangerous idea: that the torpedo had reclassified a Soviet warship as a valid target. Thermal anomaly became the preferred term in all paperwork. Diagrams were drawn showing refracted sonar cones. Weather data was cherry-picked to support the case. Even a previously unrelated oceanographic report was appended to the file to lend scientific weight. No one on the exercise's front line bought it. The submarine's weapons officer, who had monitored the torpedo's initial lock, later told a colleague in confidence thermal layers don't override logic. That torpedo made a choice, but his opinion never made it into the final summary. Under the thermal theory, no systems needed to change. No engineers had to answer uncomfortable questions. No training protocols required revision. The fix, if any, was procedural review pre-launch environmental data more carefully. It was, in effect, a bureaucratic sedative, and it worked for a while, until a post-exercise audit of the torpedo's factory programming revealed something no one expected. The Type 65's training variant had not received its downgraded tracking algorithm update. It was still running its full combat acoustic profile, complete with autonomous reacquisition behavior. The torpedo had been a sleeper, trained for war, fired in peace, and never told the difference. But even that revelation was buried, because the thermal theory had already been ratified. To reverse it would mean admitting not only a software oversight, but a near-fatal one. So the wrong theory remained, and the true cause was quietly archived under internal-only access. The Soviet system had done what it always did. It found a truth it could survive, and erased the one it couldn't. All while the men who'd faced the torpedo's charge remembered every turn, every siren, every second, as a reminder that sometimes the lie is safer than the answer. As the thermal pocket explanation settled into official doctrine, a second, more sinister theory began to emerge from the intelligence wing of the Soviet Navy. one that carried a different kind of danger: electronic sabotage. Some believed the torpedo's guidance failure wasn't natural or accidental, but the result of a hostile signal injected by a foreign actor, specifically NATO. This theory suggested that a U.S. submarine, likely a Los Angeles-class hunter-killer, trailing the Soviet exercise from international waters, had spoofed the torpedo's guidance system, with a covert frequency either jamming its wire control link or mimicking an enemy acoustic signature to redirect its targeting. To those already steeped in Cold War paranoia, it made perfect sense. After all, NATO had long invested in electronic warfare. The U.S. Navy was rumored to be developing broadband sonar pulses capable of inducing misclassification in passive guidance systems. If they had used one in a Soviet drill, it would be a psychological operation of devastating precision. One officer even claimed that a burst transmission had been recorded milliseconds before the torpedo veered off course. No content, just static. He couldn't prove it came from NATO. He couldn't even prove it was real. But for the believers, that was enough. Naval intelligence analysts pounced on the idea. Internal memos began referencing electronic spoofing vulnerability as a strategic concern. Exercises were revised to account for possible Western intervention. Some submarines began running acoustic shadowing monitoring for outside sonar noise, even during training runs. There was only one problem. No one ever found proof. No U.S. sub had been confirmed in the area. No intercepted signals matched known spoofing patterns. The torpedo log showed no external interference, only a clean break in the wire link, followed by autonomous acquisitions behavior within design parameters. But the theory refused to die. Why? Because it served a purpose. It meant the Soviet Navy hadn't failed. It meant the technology hadn't betrayed them. It meant that if a Soviet ship had almost been sunk by a Soviet weapon, the true blame lay outside the wire. The theory was wrong. It was unsupported. And yet it reshaped policy. More drills, more countermeasure development, more suspicion. And meanwhile, the real lesson that a torpedo had acted on misclassified acoustic logic and nearly caused a fratricide event was ignored. The second wrong theory didn't just mislead. It inoculated the system against self-awareness, and in doing so, guaranteed that someday the mistake might happen again, with no training label to soften the blow. Weeks after the incident, a quiet internal investigation was launched not by high command, but by a mid-tier software engineer assigned to the Torpedo Development Bureau in Severodvinsk. What he discovered would never be released publicly. The Type 65 training torpedo involved in the near fratricide had been deployed with an outdated combat targeting package 1 designed for full war scenarios, not controlled exercises. Its software still contained autonomous targeting logic, designed to identify enemy acoustic signatures in real time and re-engage if wire guidance was lost. This configuration had been flagged months earlier. Internal memoranda from the torpedo design team warned that the new pattern recognition updates were overly sensitive and could cause friendly target misclassification, especially in cluttered sonar environments with multiple Soviet vessels in formation. But the upgrade patch, a standard update to downgrade the logic for training purposes, had been delayed. Bureaucratic backlog, interdepartmental miscommunication, budget constraints. A senior officer had even signed a waiver authorizing the use of the unpatched batch in non-critical drills, only assuming, of course, that proper separation protocols would be followed. They weren't. The submarine crew had received no notification that the torpedo was running combat-grade logic. The wire guidance link was assumed to be sufficient, and when it failed, the torpedo did exactly what it was built to do. It listened, it analyzed, and it hunted the most acoustically significant target it could find, the friendly cruiser, the entire system engineers. Command. Logistics had conspired to let a fully autonomous tracking weapon loose in a friendly exercise, with no one aware of what it might do once cut free. This was not sabotage, not weather, not foreign interference. This was a design flaw wrapped in a communications failure, sealed by assumption, the most damning part. A post-mortem systems review showed that 3 other training torpedoes currently in circulation shared the same flawed software. None had been grounded. All were cleared for use in upcoming naval drills. The officer who discovered this requested a fleet-wide recall. He was transferred the following month. The report was buried under technical annexes, classified at the internal maintenance level, invisible to operational commanders. To acknowledge its contents would require rewriting an entire tier of naval weapons policy. Instead, the system did what it always did: compartmentalize the truth. A cascading chain of failures had nearly destroyed a Soviet warship. Not because of betrayal, not because of the enemy, but because no one asked what the machine would do if left alone, and no one believed the answer when it came. Across the ocean, in the halls of the U.S. Navy's Naval Undersea Warfare Center in Newport, Rhode Island, similar fears had already been faced and solved. Back in 1971, a U.S. torpedo test in the Atlantic had gone wrong. A wire-guided training weapon lost connection mid-run and began circling erratically. It didn't strike a friendly vessel, but it came close enough to terrify everyone on board. That incident triggered an immediate overhaul of American torpedo doctrine. By 1973, the U.S. had implemented dual confirmation acoustic validation, a fail-safe requiring 2 independent onboard systems to verify a target's identity before switching from training to autonomous guidance. Wire break alone would no longer trigger combat logic. In addition, the U.S. integrated real-time signal differentiation using machine learning-style pattern recognition to match not just propeller harmonics, but signature complexity, directionality, and vessel noise ratios. In other words, a U.S. training torpedo wouldn't just chase the loudest sound. It would chase the right one or none at all. Training weapons were also given fixed no-go zones based on fleet positioning. If a friendly ship entered the cone, the torpedo would self-abort. Submarine crews drilled for these contingencies. If wire guidance was lost, they had a tree of decisions, not a panic response. The control systems included a remote kill switch, physical cutoff, and a third option, passive silence, letting the torpedo continue until its logic expired without target reacquisition. The U.S. learned the hard way that trusting a torpedo to know what to do was suicidal, so they built in doubt. By contrast, the Soviet system was fast, elegant, and brittle. The Soviet Navy prioritized response speed. Their torpedoes were designed to kill American carrier groups quickly, without waiting for human reconfirmation. It made their arsenal terrifying on paper, but in a training scenario, that same aggressiveness turned every misclassification into a potential death sentence. Soviet culture did not reward redundancy, it punished hesitation, and so the very strengths of Soviet weapons, autonomous logic, aggressive targeting, minimal manual override became vulnerabilities in the fog of a controlled exercise. The Americans had accepted friction, they designed around uncertainty. The Soviets had engineered confidence, and in doing so, left no room for errors that didn't look like failure. The Type 65 training torpedo had done what it was told. It had heard a war in the middle of a drill, and the only thing that stopped it was fuel. When the torpedo finally sank to the bottom, inert and out of fuel, the visible threat ended. But the real damage was just beginning. In the hours that followed, both the submarine and cruiser reported back to Fleet Command with stripped-down versions of the event. But word had already spread. Among sailors, it wasn't called a malfunction. It was called a betrayal. Some referred to the weapon as the Judas fish. Others, more bitterly, called it our American torpedo, as if only the enemy could design something so dangerous and dumb. Within a week, an internal panel was convened an investigation in name only. Its purpose was clear assign blame without shaking doctrine. The torpedo software team was scapegoated first. Engineers were accused of failing to confirm the training configuration. A pair of junior developers were reassigned to desk duty in Murmansk. One reportedly burned his clearance badge in protest, but the software hadn't launched the torpedo. Command decisions had. The submarine's captain received a formal reprimand for insufficient awareness of updated engagement protocols despite never being informed of the software issue. He filed an appeal. It was rejected. 6 months later, he took early retirement. The cruiser's captain was praised publicly for his emergency maneuver. Privately, he was warned not to discuss the acoustic logs. He kept a printout of the torpedo's approach vector locked in his safe. Fleet Command didn't want truth. They wanted containment. One unnamed fleet officer proposed a radical fix: withdraw all autonomous torpedoes from training scenarios until acoustic logic could be overhauled. The proposal never left the conference room. Why? Because it admitted fragility. And fragility didn't exist in Soviet weapons doctrine, at least not on paper. Meanwhile, the men who'd lived through the event carried the memory like ballast. A sonar operator on the cruiser stopped trusting training runs. A weapons officer aboard the submarine reportedly refused to fire another torpedo in exercise conditions. He was rotated to land duty. And the torpedo, its serial number, was quietly retired. The rest of the batch remained in use, though quietly modified. The official report labeled the event a multi-system interaction anomaly, but sailors had a different term for it. They called it the time we almost killed ourselves on accident. Not from failure, but from faith in a system that didn't know how to stop itself. The torpedo never exploded. No ships sank. No flags were lowered to half-mast. And yet, something inside the Soviet Navy fractured that day, something harder to name, but impossible to repair. It wasn't just a training accident. It was a doctrinal rupture. A moment when the technological certainty that underpinned Soviet naval pride precision weapons, confident automation, engineered dominance was exposed as fragile, even dangerous. Inside Fleet Command, it sparked whispered reassessments. If a torpedo designed for safety could go rogue, if no one aboard could override it, if it locked onto a friendly ship in a controlled scenario, then what else could malfunction, misread, or misfire? Commanders began to question not just the tools, but the logic that shaped their deployment. The blind trust in system infallibility, the presumption that obedience ensured security, the idea that faster was always better. And yet none of this could be said aloud. To challenge doctrine was to challenge the hierarchy. To challenge the hierarchy was to challenge the state. So officers buried their questions behind tightened lips and longer drills. More manuals were issued, more forms, more simulations. But beneath the paperwork, a new fear simmered. Not that NATO would outgun them, but that their own systems might betray them again next time with a live warhead. The ideological foundation of the Soviet Navy, that perfect engineering could overcome imperfect circumstances, had taken a hit it couldn't absorb. Because now everyone who'd seen that torpedo change course knew perfection was an illusion. The weapon didn't fail because it was broken. It failed because it followed its programming in a world too chaotic for clean logic. It failed because it obeyed without question, just like the men who built it. And that obedience, once celebrated as strength, now looked like a slow path to suicide. There were no parades after the incident, no speeches, no lessons published in Red Star, just the silence of sailors who'd been targeted by their own system, and the heavy knowledge that their survival had come down not to discipline or design, but luck. And in war, luck was not a strategy. Years later, in a naval academy off the coast of Vladivostok, instructors quietly began to include an unofficial story during submarine warfare training. It wasn't in any textbook. It didn't have a designation or incident code. But every cadet knew the phrase, the torpedo that came home. It was passed on in hushed tones, more ghost story than doctrine. A training weapon, they'd say, designed to simulate war, that nearly sparked one on its own side. No explosion, no bodies, but an unmistakable scar burned into the culture of the fleet. Because in that moment, every lesson about command and control, about infallible design, about the supremacy of Soviet engineering crumbled under one question. What happens when the system does exactly what it's told at the wrong time? The event never made the headlines. It wasn't leaked to the West. No monuments were raised, but it echoed in small ways in the way sonar techs triple-checked their returns, in the revised depth limits of future exercises, in the quiet glances exchanged during system checks before a torpedo launch, not because of sabotage, not because of enemies, but because of a ghost coded in logic, launched by protocol, stopped only by fuel. Today, as modern navies lean harder into automation, AI targeting, and algorithmic control, the lesson remains as urgent as ever. Obedience is not safety. Speed is not intelligence. And the most dangerous weapon is the one that doesn't know it's wrong. If you found this story as haunting and essential as we did, subscribe to this channel. We publish Cold War breakdowns every week, revealing how close the world came to disaster, not through battle, but through system error. Hit the bell to stay informed, stay skeptical, stay sharp, because history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it reacquires you.